Every mystery has a voice. Few dare to listen.
It was generally felt in the village of Hetheridge Parva that Mrs. Honoria Felbright had been quite done in for years before her body was discovered, though even the most obliging parish gossip could not have anticipated that the final undoing would occur so suddenly and with such theatrical tidiness. She had been found that fog-laden Thursday morning reclining in her narrow iron bed, stiff as her own moral expectations, the blankets drawn up to the chin with almost embarrassing propriety. The expression upon her thin face suggested she had seen something disagreeable at the last, perhaps the peeling wallpaper or, more likely, the unfinished embroidery that had haunted her bedside table for the better part of a decade. The window stood fractionally open, breathing in a damp draught from the churchyard below. From her room one could see the leaning gravestones, those grey, lichen-speckled slabs that seemed to tilt perpetually toward the house, as though eavesdropping on the living. More than one visitor had remarked upon the unpleasant sensation of being watched by the dead while sampling Mrs. Felbright's tepid seed cake. But the matter was not put before Lord Peter Wimsey until much later, when he arrived with the casualness of a man who frequently wanders into trouble with the same cheerfulness others wander into a tea-room. He had been motoring north for no better reason than to avoid a literary luncheon in London, at which he had been scheduled to deliver remarks on the detection of false quotation. A last-minute escape, an accidental misreading of the invitation, had sent him humming along the lanes in his Lagonda, content with the autumnal mists and the faintly ecclesiastical smell of wet leaves. Hetheridge Parva was the sort of place in which nothing ever happened except births, burials, and the occasional scandal involving jam-making competitions. It might never have detained Wimsey at all, had not Sergeant Pym waved him down with the enthusiasm of a man spotting reinforcements in an otherwise hopeless skirmish. "Begging your pardon, my lord. Didn't expect you through these parts," puffed the sergeant, wiping the mist from his moustache. He looked like a man who had been waiting all morning for a miracle and had finally settled for a nobleman. "My good Pym," said Wimsey, settling his monocle with the air of a man adjusting the universe to more intelligible dimensions. "One may expect anything in these parts. I have passed in the last 10 minutes a butcher's boy singing selections from Götterdämmerung and a cat of atheistical aspect lounging on the porch of the vicarage. I trust the rest of the local fauna behaves with equal originality." Pym blinked. "Oh, yes, my lord. But it's Mrs. Felbright, you see. Widow Felbright. Found in her bed this morning. Doctor says heart failure, but—" He lowered his voice. "We aren't so sure." "Hearts," observed Wimsey, unfastening his driving gloves, "have an aggravating habit of failing under the most inconvenient circumstances, very inconsiderate organs. Still, there is a shade of hesitation in your tone. Tell me all." "Well, my lord, perhaps nothing. It's her room. Faces the churchyard, it does, and the window was open, only a crack, but she never slept with it open. Said the air from the graves gave her rheumatism. A medical theory of questionable provenance," Wimsey murmured. "And yet the window was open." "Yes, my lord, and there's something else. The vicar, Reverend Ullswater, swears he heard her bedroom bell ring at 11:30 last night." "Her bedroom bell?" "Yes, my lord. One of those little servant call bells wired down to the kitchen. Only she hasn't kept a maid for 5 years. "How domestically poignant," said Wimsey. "A bell that may ring but will not be answered, like a great many people in society." He stepped from the motor car with the brisk relish of a hound invited to sniff out a promising scent. "Very well, Pym. Let us have a look at the lady who disliked the breath of her neighbours in the churchyard so intensely that she expired facing them." Pym hesitated. "You don't think—" "My dear fellow," said Wimsey lightly, "I think nothing at all. That is the privilege of ignorance, but I shall be charmed to acquire some suspicions presently." And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey followed the sergeant toward Felbright House, a tall, narrow structure whose windows stared blankly toward the graves, while a chilly wind curled among the tombstones below, as though eager to whisper its own version of events into the detective's ear. Whimsy found the interior of Felbright House so precisely tidy that it seemed to resent intrusion. The hallway smelled faintly of camphor and old hymn books, and somewhere in the distance a clock ticked with moral severity. A framed sampler near the stairs declared, "Cleanliness is nearer to godliness," a sentiment Mrs. Felbright had evidently pursued with missionary zeal. Sergeant Pym shuffled ahead, clearing his throat as though apologizing to the furniture for bringing in outsiders. "Dr. Mallows left just before I fetched you, my lord. He's still calling it natural causes. Heart simply gave out." "A tempting diagnosis," Whimsy murmured, "when the patient is elderly, respectable, and inconveniently dead. It absolves one of so many little inquiries." He followed Pym up the narrow staircase to the widow's bedroom. The air there held the chilly stillness of a room that had been dutifully aired but never warmed. The window was indeed open, a small stubborn crack through which the mist slithered in, curling around the bed as though reluctant to leave the occupant. Whimsy crossed to it at once and tapped the sash lightly. "Stiff," he noted. "This window has not been opened in many moons. The house, it seems, disapproves of ventilation." He examined the paint, cracked in a way that suggested the hinge had protested last night's use. Someone forced it open, or at least someone with determination. Pym swallowed. "She never touched it, my lord. Always complained of draughts. Said the stones out there," he nodded toward the churchyard, "creaked at night." "The dead," murmured Whimsy, "are often blamed for noises that have far more banal origins. Pipes, for example. Or guilt." His eyes drifted to a small brass bell pull beside the bed, its tassel still swaying ever so slightly in the faint draught. "This," he said, "may be the most intriguing ornament in the room." He tugged it gently. Somewhere far below, a muffled jangle answered, a lonely, anachronistic sound. "No maid for years," Whimsy said softly, yet she rang the bell at 11:30, a curious gesture. Was she expecting someone, or trying to summon someone who no longer existed? Before Pym could speculate, footsteps sounded on the landing. A thin grey man appeared, removing his hat with an air of subdued terror. Reverend Ullswater looked like a man perpetually startled by life. "Oh, Lord Peter, I did not know you were here already." Of course. I hope I'm not intruding." "You are intruding most helpfully, Reverend," said Whimsy, offering a polite inclination of the head. "Sergeant Pym tells me you heard the bell last night." The vicar's hands fluttered like startled birds. I suppose I did. Quite unmistakable. I was preparing my sermon, rather late, I fear. The window of my study was open and the sound carried across the garden. At 11:30? Yes. An odd time, certainly. She was not one for nocturnal summons. I thought perhaps she had mislaid her spectacles again. She would occasionally call for her maid, dear Alice, though Alice has been gone these 5 years. Habit is strange in the elderly. "Indeed," Whimsy said, gazing at the bed, "though the dying seldom ring bells unless they desire help. Did you come over to investigate?" The vicar coloured. "I'm afraid not. I dismissed it as nostalgia on her part. The sound unnerved me, I confess. Like hearing an echo of something that ought not to echo. I decided to inquire in the morning." Whimsy turned, inspecting Ullswater with gentle but pointed curiosity. "And yet the bell did ring. The question, Reverend, is, for whom?" Ullswater shivered. "A morbid question, Lord Peter." "Death," said Whimsy lightly, "is a morbidly enthusiastic host." He drifted from the bed toward a small writing desk near the window. There he paused. A thin layer of dust coated the wood, except for one area, a neat rectangle where something had recently lain. A book, perhaps, or a small box. Whatever it was had been removed, and recently. "Pym," Whimsy said quietly, "was anything taken from this room?" "Not that we know of. Nothing looks disturbed." "That," said Whimsy, "is the most disturbing thing of all." He crouched, examining a small disturbance in the dust just beside the empty rectangle, an indent, faint but perceptible, as though a thumb had pressed down before lifting an object. The gesture felt deliberate, hesitant. Behind him, Ullswater shifted uneasily. "I assure you, Lord Peter, Mrs. Felbright led a quiet life. No valuables to speak of. No visitors. Practically a hermit. The village thought her peculiar, but harmless." "Harmless people," Whimsy said softly, "have a tendency to know things they oughtn't." Ullswater blinked. "Know things?" "Secrets, Reverend, are very democratic. They rest comfortably with the respectable as well as with the wicked." The vicar made a small strangled sound, something between a cough and a lost protest. Whimsy straightened, dusting his fingers. "Tell me, Mr. Ullswater, did Mrs. Felbright ever mention anything troubling? Anxieties? Visitors she preferred not to name?" The vicar hesitated. Too long. Whimsy caught it at once. Well, there were small matters. I would not call them troubling. Superstitions, perhaps. She sometimes spoke of shadows in the churchyard, figures near the yew tree. I told her it was nonsense. "And did she accept this charitable dismissal?" "Not entirely," Ullswater admitted, wringing his hands. "She said the figure watched her window." Whimsy glanced toward the pane, toward the gravestones, leaning inquisitively upward, as if eager to overhear. "A watching figure," he repeated. "How very atmospheric, but not, I think, supernatural. People watch windows for very earthly reasons. Money, fear, revenge, or perhaps," his eyes narrowed, "because something in that room was worth watching." Ullswater swallowed. "But she was a harmless old widow. No relatives. No enemies." "Enemies," said Whimsy, "have the curious habit of being created by people who least expect to possess them." He moved once more to the bed, studying the tableau of death with the dispassionate eye of a man cataloguing a puzzle rather than a tragedy. "Pym," he said, "I should like to see Mrs. Felbright's effects, letters, bills, any little domestic absurdities she kept. People betray themselves on paper, you know. It's far more reliable than conversation." Pym nodded and hurried off. The vicar lingered awkwardly. "One more question," Whimsy said, adjusting his monocle. "Yes?" Ullswater whispered. "Did you by any chance see anyone in the churchyard late last night?" The hesitation this time was shorter, but still present. "I thought I saw a movement. A shadow, perhaps. But the fog was thick. It could have been anything." "Or anyone," murmured Whimsy. He did not press further. Not yet. Instead, he crossed to the window again and looked down onto the churchyard. The mist rolled sluggishly over the stones, like a creature breathing in sleep. Someone had stood there last night, watching, waiting, and someone had entered this room, despite the stiff window, despite the bell that should not have rung, removing an object that had lain on the writing desk. The neatness of Mrs. Felbright's death was beginning to look untidy in all the right ways. Whimsy smiled faintly. "Reverend," he said, "I suspect Mrs. Felbright lived a considerably more interesting life than she intended." And as Ullswater retreated with a tremor of unease, Whimsy turned back to the silent room, inhaling the cold air. The churchyard stones did not creak, but the living, he suspected, had made quite enough noise last night. Pym reappeared a few minutes later with a cardboard box clutched to his chest, as though fearful the contents might leap out and accuse him of meddling. Whimsy waved him toward the narrow writing desk, where a faint crescent of disturbed dust still hinted at the missing object. "Her personal papers, my lord," Pym announced. "Collected from the lower drawer." Nothing much. Old bills, church notices, a few letters. Whimsy drew up a rather unforgiving wooden chair and began sorting through the papers with the fastidious efficiency of a man solving a crossword. The letters were few indeed, half a dozen at most, and all addressed to Mrs. Honoria Fellbright in a brittle, aging hand. Bills from the grocer, hymn society reminders, a stern note from the vicar regarding the Day of Atonement bake sale. Human conflict at its most sugary. He paused, holding up one envelope. But this is interesting. No postmark. Delivered by hand, I dare say. He slit it open. Pym and Ullswater leaned unconsciously closer. The note inside was remarkably short. You must stop. This is your last warning. No signature. No flourishes. Only the tremulous insistence of a writer who either feared discovery or was impatient with civility. Ullswater nearly gasped. Good heavens, stop what? An excellent question, Reverend. And the second question follows naturally. Who objected to her doing it? Whimsy refolded the note with a thoughtful hum. But someone, it seems, was rather definite about the matter. Pym scratched his head. Looks like blackmail, my lord. Or a threat. Not blackmail. Too brief, too urgent. A blackmailer is a creative writer. He enjoys exposition. This is something else. A warning implies that the recipient was doing something actionable. Ullswater tutted anxiously. Mrs. Fellbright? But she did nothing except complain about drafts and attend matins. That is the trouble with respectable old ladies, Whimsy said lightly. Their privacy is so absolute that nobody imagines they might dabble in anything inconvenient. Yet someone thought she must be stopped. He continued leafing through the papers, pausing occasionally at some small note or receipt, but finding no further drama. A few devotional pamphlets, a scrap of lace, a grocery list written in pinched, determined script. Every item was ordinary to the point of stubbornness. Too ordinary, perhaps. It was the box's bottom that contained the only other curiosity. A tiny iron key, old-fashioned, the sort that might have belonged to a cupboard or a discreet drawer rather than a door. Its surface was polished with use. Now then, Whimsy murmured, what little secret were you unlocking, Mrs. Fellbright? Pym frowned. I didn't see any locked drawers or cabinets in here. Precisely, said Whimsy, slipping the key into his pocket. Which means the lock it fits is elsewhere, and Mrs. Fellbright used it recently. He rose and crossed to the bedside table. Empty. Only a water glass, a Bible, and a small embroidered cloth depicting an angel who looked uncomfortably stern. Nothing locked. He checked the wardrobe, likewise free of anything requiring keys. The desk drawers opened willingly. The narrow cupboard by the door held nothing but blankets. If the key belonged to Mrs. Fellbright, its lock was not in her bedroom. The vicar cleared his throat. She had a small cupboard downstairs in the sitting room, he offered tentatively. One she kept for keepsakes, but I believe it has no lock, not for years. Then we shall see it shortly, Whimsy said. Never trust an old cupboard to remain simple. They often conceal ambitions. He returned, almost reluctantly, to the bed. Something was niggling him, all neatness, all composure. He studied the widow's face again. No struggle, no disarray. Even her hand, which rested lightly on the coverlet, seemed arranged, posed. Sergeant, was her position altered? Did anyone try to revive her or adjust the bedclothes? No, my lord. We found her just so. Dr. Mallows checked her pulse, declared her gone, and said she must have died peacefully. Peace, Whimsy said, is a subjective state. Rooms can lie as easily as people. He lifted the coverlet gently, observing the nightdress. It was fastened properly, not a button askew. Then his gaze caught a faint smudge on her sleeve, barely visible. But there, a small, pale grey streak like dust or chalk. He sniffed it lightly, frowning. Grave dust, he murmured. or possibly mortar. And I doubt Mrs. Felbright spent her final hours rubbing against churchyard stones. Ullswater paled. You think someone touched her? After she was gone? I think, said Wimsey, that someone came into this room after 11 o'clock last night, opened a stiffened window, took something from her desk, and then, most curiously, arranged her with such reverence that one might believe she died in her sleep. But why? Asked Pym. For the oldest reason in the world, my dear Pym. They wished to hide whatever discord had occurred before death. He stepped back, surveying the room with a narrowing of eyes. Everything was tidy, unruffled, and entirely inconsistent with a visit from a desperate intruder. Too neat, too perfect, Wimsey repeated under his breath. Order is sometimes the most suspicious of disorders. He turned sharply. Pym, take me to the kitchen. I want to see where this bell leads. A bell that rings without a servant is capable of very interesting behavior. They descended the stairs, footsteps echoing through the narrow house. The kitchen was cold and square, with a scrubbed table and a row of hooks from which hung a modest selection of pots. On the far wall, the receiving bell protruded from an iron bracket, a thin wire trailing up along the plaster. Wimsey examined it. Dust lay thick along the bracket, except for the bell itself, where a tiny arc had been rubbed clean. He tapped the metal softly. Someone silenced this bell. Recently. Pym stared. Silenced? Yes. One can keep a kitchen bell from ringing by placing a hand. Here, beneath the striker. You see the mark. He gestured to the faint skin oil shine. Someone waited here last night listening. Listening for what? Ullswater whispered. For the widow to ring her bell, said Wimsey. And when she did, the visitor ensured no one else would hear it. But why ring it at all? Pym asked. Oh, that, said Wimsey, smiling faintly, is what we must discover next. He stepped back, hands into pockets, considering the house, the bell, the missing object, the warning note, the watching figure in the churchyard. Every thread tugged at another, every detail hinted at a shape still just beyond resolution. Sergeant, Wimsey said softly, I should like to speak to the villagers, all of them, but especially those who had reason to pass near the churchyard last night. Hetheridge Parva is not a place where people go unnoticed. Someone saw something. And if they didn't, Pym added stoutly, we'll find someone who heard something. Oh, they heard, said Wimsey. Villagers always hear. What they choose to repeat is another matter. He reached for his hat. Come, Pym. Let us take a little constitutional through the village. Somewhere between the butcher's boy and the vicarage cat lies the truth. And I should be very annoyed with myself if I failed to coax it out before sunset. Wimsey found the air outside Felbright House unusually hushed, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Mist clung to the cottages along the lane, softening their outlines, making each window appear slightly too watchful. Even the rooks circling the church tower seemed to croak with a kind of muted discretion, as if guarding a secret on behalf of the parish. Sergeant Pym trotted beside him in dutiful silence until Wimsey paused at the low stone wall separating the lane from the churchyard. The gravestones leaned at improbable angles like shabby spectators at a clandestine meeting. It strikes me, Wimsey murmured, tapping the wall lightly with his cane, that the living of Hetheridge Parva have made an admirable arrangement with the dead. They leave one another alone as far as possible. A pity, then, when a corpse declines to behave. He stepped through the lich gate, eyes narrowing. The grass retained traces of night moisture, and the path squelched softly underfoot. But Wimsey ignored the main walkway and instead veered toward the ancient yew tree Mrs. Felbright had mentioned in her worried remarks to the vicar. It loomed thickly, its branches tangled overhead like the ribs of a collapsed cathedral. Beneath it, the ground was noticeably disturbed. Not recently dug, no sinister mound, but scuffed, as though someone had stood there for some time, watching the house, watching her window. Pym looked uneasy. Could be animals, my lord. Plenty of foxes about. Foxes, said Whimsy, rarely remain still long enough to contemplate widows' bedchambers. He crouched, examining the earth. The impressions were faint, barely there. A shallow indentation that might be a heel, a patch where grass bent in an unnatural angle. No clear footprint, but the paws of a human presence hung in the air like breath on glass. He straightened. Someone stood here, a person who waited a long while, watching an elderly woman who had, until very recently, lived an admirably uneventful life. Why? That is the most demanding of questions, Pym. It breeds all its own troublesome offspring. They left the churchyard, crossing back into the lane. As they approached the village green, familiar shapes emerged from the mist. Cottages with drooping thatch, a pump in need of oiling, and the squat, square form of the Crow's Wing, the local public house. From within came the murmur of voices, subdued, cautious, already tuned to scandal. The villagers, upon seeing Whimsy, stiffened like hens recognizing a fox with a monocle. Pym cleared his throat. No need to be alarmed, folks. Lord Peter's just asking a few questions. A woman in an apron produced a tremulous, "Terrible business, sir. Poor Mrs. Felbright. Always said her window looked too near the graves." Then she possessed admirable powers of prophecy, Whimsy replied lightly. Tell me, anyone out late last night? 3 heads shook in rapid succession. No, my lord. Fog was thick as wool. Except, perhaps, ventured the blacksmith's wife, for Mr. Marlowe. He came stumbling home near midnight, smelled like the brewery roof again. Whimsy raised a brow. Midnight? And where does Mr. Marlowe live? Down the road, sir, past the vicarage, toward the church. That, Whimsy said pleasantly, is a most interesting direction. Pym shifted. Marlowe's a harmless fellow, my lord. Drinks too much, but never caused real trouble. Drunkenness, said Whimsy, is a profoundly democratic vice. It excuses all manner of mischief without necessarily absolving it. He walked on, following a narrow track behind the green, until Marlowe's cottage came into view, a squat, peeling structure with a sagging gate and a neglected garden. A man sat slumped on a stool by the door, contemplating a mug with philosophical misery. His hair resembled a haystack attacked by crows. "Marlowe," Pym barked. "On your feet. Lord Peter wants a word." Marlowe blinked at Whimsy with the expression of a man uncertain whether the nobleman was real or an alcohol-induced mirage. "Evening, morning, whatever it is," he muttered. "Marlowe," said Whimsy in his most affable tone, "might I inquire whether the fog or spirits kept you company last night?" Marlowe rubbed his nose. "Bit of both, sir. Left the pub around? Well, 11:30 maybe. Hard to say. Time's slippery when the beer's good." "And upon leaving the pub," Whimsy continued, "you walked home by the churchyard path?" It was not a question, yet Marlowe flinched. "Aye," he admitted, voice thick. "Shortcut. Did you see anything along the way?" "Fog," Marlowe said promptly. "And besides the fog?" "Well," he hesitated, eyes darting to Pym as though hoping for salvation. "There was a shape. Thought it were a statue at first. By the yew tree. Didn't move. Didn't look like nothing. Might have been me eyes. Hard to see through fog." "And the shape," Whimsy said gently. "Was it tall? Short? Stooped?" "Tallish," Marlowe grunted. "Like a pillar, but not a gravestone. I know 'em all." Whimsy's interest sharpened. "Did the shape move?" "No, that's what bothered me. Just stood there, like waiting. Made the hairs go up on me neck. I walked quicker after that." Whimsy nodded. "And after you passed, did you look back?" Marlowe swallowed. "I did. Only, when I looked, there weren't nothing there." Pym bristled. "Probably just fog, Marlowe, or you're walking crooked." But Whimsy gazed at the man with a peculiar softness. "Thank you, my friend." You've been more helpful than you know." They left Marlowe's cottage and continued down the path. The fog was lifting, revealing the church tower in pale morning light. Wimsey walked slowly, deep in thought, tapping his cane once, twice, in measured rhythm. "A tall figure," he murmured. Still silent and positioned precisely beneath her window, and vanishing the moment it was observed. Pym half smiled. "You think it were the killer, my lord?" "I think," said Wimsey, "that someone waited for Mrs. Felbright to do something, and when she did it, when she rang that bell, the visitor acted, quickly, purposefully." They approached the vicarage. Reverend Olswater's garden gate squeaked with unnecessary drama. "Let us trouble the Reverend again," Wimsey said. "I am increasingly persuaded that he knows more than he realizes." Olswater opened the door with a start, tea towel in hand. "Back again, Lord Peter. I hope matters are becoming clearer." "Infinitely," Wimsey replied, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. "I merely wish to ask one more trifling thing. You said Mrs. Felbright sometimes mentioned a figure beneath the yew tree. A watcher. Did she ever describe it?" Olswater paled. "Not exactly. Only that it stood quite still, that it never came closer, that it seemed to observe." "And yet," Wimsey said, "she remained unalarmed enough not to lock her window last night." "She never locked windows," Olswater replied, flustered. "She feared the rooms would become musty." "A woman terrified of draughts, but unconcerned with intruders," Wimsey said. "Contradictions, Reverend, are often the little signposts pointing toward truth." He glanced toward the vicar's writing desk. Papers lay strewn in clearly hurried fashion. "And you," Wimsey added neutrally, "were preparing a sermon at 11:30, rather late for ecclesiastical inspiration." Olswater stiffened. "I often work late, I dare say. But last night your study window was open. You heard the bell clearly, and yet you did not go to her." I thought it nothing, truly." Wimsey gave a faint bow. "Of course." He turned to leave, pausing only at the threshold. "Oh, Reverend, one last curiosity. Did Mrs. Felbright confide in you anything else of note in the past week? Anything at all?" Olswater hesitated, then, with evident reluctance, "She told me. She had been looking through old things, clearing out drawers. She said she had found something she should have thrown away years ago." "And did she say what it was?" "No, only that it frightened her." Wimsey's eyes gleamed. "Thank you, Mr. Olswater. That is fascinating." He stepped into the lane again, mood sharpened to a fine, glittering edge. A warning note, a missing object from her writing desk, a key to a lock that no longer existed in her room, a watcher beneath her window, a bell rung for help, and stifled, and a frightened old widow who had rediscovered something she should have destroyed. Wimsey set off with a new briskness. "Pym," he said softly, "we must find the lock that key belongs to." "For what purpose, my lord?" "For the oldest purpose imaginable," Wimsey replied. "To see precisely what Mrs. Felbright died to protect." Wimsey did not at once return to the manor, but set off down the narrow lane that skirted the churchyard wall, his long stride unhurried, his face composed in that deceptively idle expression which always made Bunter privately uneasy. The morning had grown colder. The mist hung in sluggish curls among the tombstones, softening their edges and lending the place an atmosphere of damp simplicity, as though the dead were politely averting their gaze from whatever the living were muddling through. He paused near the lich gate, studying the ground with mild interest, as one might regard an amateur's attempt at gardening. The gravel showed signs of disturbance, fresh scuffs not quite consistent with the neat tread of parishioners. He knelt, brushed a finger along a faint groove, and rose again with the air of a man whose curiosity had been gently confirmed rather than piqued. It was only when the vicar emerged from behind a cluster of laurels, clutching a stack of hymnals and blinking like a startled owl, that Wimsey bestirred himself to speech. Good morning, Canon Atherton. You keep your churchyard remarkably lively for a place consecrated to eternal quiet. The vicar gave a soft puff of dismay. Oh, Lord Peter, I didn't see you. You gave me quite a start. Not at all, my dear Atherton. I assure you the initiative was entirely yours. He tapped his cane lightly against the lich gate. Tell me, have you had many visitors this morning besides the police? Anyone paying their respects to the departed rather prematurely? No, at least none that have come through the vicarage side. Though I did hear footsteps earlier. Rather hurried ones. I assumed it must be Constable Fincher. Whimsy's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Indeed, Fincher, as I recall, plants his feet with all the enthusiasm of a man stamping potatoes. These were lighter, I imagine. The vicar considered. Perhaps. Yes, I suppose they were. Whimsy let the matter drop as lightly as it had arisen, strolling beside him toward the modest wooden door that led to the nave. Atherton, you officiated at Mr. Godfrey Holst's funeral last Michaelmas, did you not? Of course. A sadly attended affair. Poor man had grown quite reclusive in his final years. Yet his wife maintained rather a different reputation. Sociable, immaculate, tragically shattered by his loss. The clergyman nodded gravely. A loyal wife, to be sure. Though, well, grief is a peculiar instrument, Lord Peter. It is that, Whimsy murmured. A violin tuned too tightly produces shrieks rather than music. Too loosely, and one gets nothing but flaccid moans. The vicar looked at him in bewilderment, but chose, wisely, not to follow the metaphor too far. Inside the church the air was chill, the great stone arches receding into shadow. Whimsy inspected the pews, the sanctuary lamp, the vestry door, the everyday bric-a-brac of parish life, before wandering toward the east window. The churchyard beyond lay in muted greys and greens. From this vantage point, he could see the rear corner of the manor and, just visible, the shutter of the late Mrs. Holst's room. It's curious, he said lightly, how proximity lends itself to presumption. Our dear widow spent every night but her last in that bedroom overlooking your hallowed ground. She must have known every creak of the headstones. The vicar shuddered. Some say she had grown obsessed with it, Lord Peter. She complained to me only a week ago that she heard rustling outside her window. Too deliberate to be the wind. I suggested it might be foxes. And did she accept that explanation with becoming piety? I fear not. She seemed genuinely frightened. Ah. Whimsy's fingers tapped the sill, once, twice. Did she mention seeing anyone? Lights? Movement? No, only sounds. Though she did say something odd. She thought she heard humming, very low, almost like a lullaby. A lullaby, Whimsy repeated, his tone perfectly agreeable, as though lullabies were often performed beneath a widow's window in the dead of night. The vicar coughed. I told her such imaginings are common after a bereavement. Reasonable pastoral advice. And yet, she was not by nature hysterical, I think. Not at all. Practical, self-possessed. A woman of considerable restraint. Until restraint became intolerable, Whimsy added softly. He turned from the window, his gaze sharpening. Atherton, you have been most enlightening. I wonder, might I prevail upon you to accompany me to the vestry? I believe a trifle of information lies there which may prove important. The vicar, though puzzled, led him through the small door. The vestry was cramped, filled with cassocks, registers, and the stale perfume of incense long since extinguished. Whimsy moved directly to the tall oak cabinet where the church registers were kept, running a finger along the spines until he located the volume he sought. Burials. 1928, he murmured, flipping through pages with swift precision. Holst, Godfrey? He scanned the entry, lips pursed in a faintly appreciative whistle. Curious. What is? The vicar asked anxiously. The hour of interment, Whimsy replied lightly. 4:30 in the afternoon, already quite dim at that time of year. One might say an hour ripe for misinterpretations. The vicar blinked at him. I don't follow. No matter. One day I shall either explain it or confess to being utterly mistaken, which is always an invigorating experience. He closed the register with a decisive snap and glanced up toward the rafters, as though listening to something the building itself whispered to him. And now, he added, I think it is high time we return to the manor. I have a number of delicate questions for Lady Holst's housekeeper, most of them pertaining to curtains, carpets, and other famously irrelevant trifles. He smiled with immaculate politeness, but there was an unmistakable glint beneath it, sharp, metallic, and promising that whatever revelation he pursued, it would not be gentle in the finding. Whimsy's assurance that they would return directly to the manor proved accurate in direction, if not in speed, for he set off at a pace both leisurely and exacting, pausing at each bend of the church path as though the very shrubs might yield testimony if addressed with sufficient civility. The vicar followed in mild bewilderment, clutching his cassock about him like a man uncertain whether he were escorting a detective or being dragged along as an accomplice in some obscure ritual. By the time they reached the narrow lane leading to the Holst estate, the mist had thinned. The churchyard lay behind them in a subdued hush, and the manor ahead appeared rigidly self-contained, its gabled roof and shuttered windows holding their secrets with stubborn correctness. Yet Whimsy's expression brightened at the sight of Bunter waiting under the portico. Ah, Bunter, any earth-shattering revelations during my brief ecclesiastical detour? None of catastrophic description, my lord, Bunter replied with dignified restraint, though Mrs. Hallow has been inquiring after you. She seemed eager, perhaps excessively so, to clarify a matter concerning the late mistress's linens. Linens, Whimsy declared cheerfully. The backbone of civilization. Lead on. Mrs. Hallow, the housekeeper, awaited them in the morning room, a brisk figure in a stiff black dress, her eyes darting about with the controlled ferocity of a hen guarding questionable chicks. She curtsied to the vicar, but her attention clung to Whimsy with ferocious intent. My lord, I must speak plainly. These policemen, pardon me, Canon, they don't understand how the household was run. They're asking foolish questions, whether the mistress had callers, whether anyone came to the servants' entrance, whether she was afraid. And I told them Mrs. Holst was a lady of dignity. She did not fret. She did not brood. She certainly did not fear noises in the night. Whimsy settled into a chair with feline ease. Noises, Mrs. Hallow? I believe no one mentioned noises. Until now. The housekeeper flushed, only because the vicar said something to one of them, I'm sure. Mrs. Holst may have commented once or twice about odd sounds in the churchyard, entirely natural in a house of this age. Ah, yes, old houses are terribly prone to rustling, though I confess they seldom hum lullabies. She stiffened. I beg your pardon. A fanciful notion, no doubt. He smoothed his cuffs idly. But while we are airing trifles, perhaps you might enlighten me on one small curiosity. The curtains in Mrs. Holst's bedroom, heavy velvet if I recall, and the carpet, rather new, installed last year. Indeed. Mrs. Holst wished for something quieter underfoot after Mr. Holst's passing. The old boards did creak something dreadful. Quite sensible. And the windows? Any difficulty in opening them fully? None, my lord. They were fitted only 2 summers ago, opened smooth as butter. Whimsy leaned forward, elbows on knees, examining her with amiable interest. Then tell me, Mrs. Hallow, if the windows open so well, how is it that the shutter on the left-hand side is stiff enough to require a servant's assistance? For the constable had the devil's time with it. She hesitated, eyes flickering. Well, my lord, the mistress rarely opened that one. Something about the draught. The Church of England has been accused of many things, Whimsy murmured, but to conjure a draught through stone walls is a talent I had not hitherto ascribed to it. The vicar coughed politely. Mrs. Hallow's blush deepened. Whimsy rose, pacing slowly, inspecting the room's corners as if they might offer subtler truths. After a moment he said, almost casually, "When illness, or worse, occurs in a household, there is usually one object, one small personal item that goes astray. A misplaced handkerchief, a disturbed paperweight, a book returned to the wrong shelf. What was the thing displaced here, Mrs. Hallow? For I assure you, something surely was." Her hands twitched. "Nothing was disturbed. I made certain of it. I put everything right before the doctor arrived. It would not have done to let him see the room in disarray." Whimsy's voice grew silken. "Indeed, the doctor must never see disorder, but in putting things right, one must first notice what was wrong." The housekeeper stared at him, torn between duty and dread. At length she whispered, "There was the salver, the silver salver on the dresser. It was lying on its side when I found her, as though it had fallen." "And did it fall?" he asked quietly. "I cannot say, but I thought it strange. She never left it out of place." He sat back, pleased, not with her confession, but with the shape of it. "One more question. When you entered the widow's chamber, were the curtains fully drawn, half drawn, or left open?" Her brow furrowed. "Oh, fully drawn, my lord. She'd insisted on them at night. Couldn't bear the thought of moonlight on the churchyard." "Curious," Whimsy said softly. "For the constable stated they were half open when he arrived. Either someone altered them, or someone wanted the room darker for a time, then lighter." The vicar shivered. Mrs. Hallow clutched her hands tight. Whimsy's eyes gleamed, not triumphantly, but with that cool, razor-edge awareness that presaged the tightening of a net the others could not yet see. "My dear Mrs. Hallow," he said, "you have been exceedingly helpful, and now I should like to visit the widow's room once more, if you will be so kind as to show us up." She nodded, breath short. Whimsy tapped his cane lightly against the floor. "For I think," he added, almost gently, "that the walls of that room have begun to whisper, and it would be remiss of me not to listen carefully before they lapse again into silence." Mrs. Hallow led the way up the staircase with the nervous precision of a woman escorting royalty through a corridor lined with loaded mouse-traps. Each step seemed to weigh on her conscience. Each creak in the carpeted landing made her shoulders flinch. Whimsy followed with an air of pleasant abstraction, as though mounting the stairs of a country manor were merely a leisurely diversion and not a journey into the heart of a puzzle that had already begun tightening its coils around the household. At the threshold of the widow's chamber, Mrs. Hallow paused. Her hand hovered above the doorknob a moment too long, and Whimsy, ever the courteous tormentor, offered her a gentle, encouraging nod. She turned the knob with a soft metallic click. The room received them with its same heavy hush, a space preserved, not lived in. The curtains hung thickly on either side of the tall window, the hearth cold. The air had that faint, stale sweetness of a place where someone had died only recently, before the scent of occupation had time to dissipate. Whimsy walked in with slow, unhurried steps, visually cataloguing the furniture as though it were a collection of mildly interesting fossils. The vicar lingered near the door, clearly wishing to be anywhere else, preferably somewhere with sunlight and no tragic associations. Mrs. Hallow remained at the foot of the bed, rigid and watchful. Whimsy's gaze drifted first to the dresser. The silver salver stood upright now, polished to a sheen, but he crouched before it with the fastidious interest of a scholar inspecting a rare manuscript. He touched its rim lightly, then examined the wooden surface beneath. "Mrs. Hallow," he said after a moment, "you mentioned finding this on its side. Did anything rest upon it at that time? A letter, perhaps? A calling card?" She shook her head vigorously. "No, my lord. It was quite bare. I remember thinking how odd that was, that she had left it that way, but I put it back at once." "Of course." His tone was approving, almost fond. "Restoring order is no small art." He stood, crossed to the window and reached for the left shutter. It resisted noticeably. The hinges offered a low groan. He pressed, tugged, and finally managed to open it halfway before stepping back with a satisfied hum. "This resistance is not new," he remarked to no one in particular. "It has been stiff for some time. The mistress, you say, rarely opened it. Yet someone must have done so recently enough for the constable to find this shutter half open." He turned to Mrs. Hallow. "Did you open it when you discovered her?" "No, my lord. I touched nothing but the salver and the curtains." "Huh, the curtains? You closed them?" "Yes, they had been, well, not wide open, but not fully drawn either. And the morning light was quite bright. I thought it would upset the room's dignity." "Commendable," he murmured, though his eyes remained on the window frame. He examined the bottom edge of the shutter, then the sill itself, where a faint line, almost invisible, left the faintest disruption on the varnish. He did not comment immediately. Instead, he crossed to the bedside table, lifted a small porcelain box, and replaced it precisely. Then he took 2 deliberate steps toward the wardrobe, opened it, and gazed inside. Only a few garments hung there: the widow's black crepe day dress, a mauve evening shawl, and an old, well-worn coat, its lining frayed and its pockets stuffed with the miscellany of a lifetime's habits. Whimsy slid a hand into the first pocket, a handkerchief. In the second, an unexpected prize, a tiny scrap of folded paper. He withdrew it with the care of a man handling something fragile, though the paper itself looked ordinary enough. Without unfolding it, he asked quietly, "Mrs. Hallow, do you recognize this?" She paled. "No, my lord. I did not know she kept anything in that coat. She seldom wore it after her husband passed." "I imagine she didn't," Whimsy said softly. "But someone else, perhaps, did." He held the scrap briefly to the light, as though scenting its secrets, then tucked it into his pocket for later study. The vicar swallowed loudly. "Lord Peter, are you suggesting that someone entered this room after her death? Or before?" Whimsy turned with a smile that was all courtesy and absolutely no comfort. "My dear Atherton, I should be a poor detective indeed if I answered such a question prematurely. But I will say this. Everything in this household proclaims a meticulous order. One does not move a curtain, shift a shutter, disturb a salver, or rifle an old coat without announcing something, if only to the person capable of hearing it." He began pacing the perimeter of the room, lightly touching the furniture as he passed. His steps brought him back to the window once more, where he paused again, not at the sill, but at the heavy velvet curtains. He drew them shut, then opened them slowly. Halfway across, they met resistance. Not the weight of fabric, but a subtle snag. He slipped a hand behind the curtain and retrieved a tiny object, a short, dark strand of thread snagged in the velvet's fold. He held it up delicately, like a jeweler displaying a flawed gem. "Mrs. Hallow," he said, "do any of the servants wear garments of this color? A deep blue-black, perhaps a coat or shawl?" She frowned. "No, my lord. None I can think of." "No footman with a dark livery?" "We have only cook's nephew, but his uniform is brown." "Quite so." Whimsy pocketed the thread. Then he walked to the window, opened the shutter as wide as it allowed, which was not very wide, and stood, peering out toward the churchyard. His profile was quiet, thoughtful, almost contemplative. But when he spoke again, his tone was edged with something sharper. "Mrs. Hallow, will you be so kind as to tell me, without embroidery, whether the mistress kept any visitor's record? Notes of callers, appointments?" "She did," the housekeeper admitted after a small battle with herself. "In her writing desk, but the police already checked it." "Checked," Whimsy echoed. "But did they understand it?" He crossed to the desk, opened the top drawer, and withdrew a thin, leather-bound book. He flipped through a few pages, nodding, with mild satisfaction. Then he paused at one particular entry, written in tight, careful script. The date was from 3 days before the widow's death. The name beside it was only a single initial, followed by a dash. W. He closed the book gently, as though afraid to disturb the ink. Behind him, the vicar uttered a bewildered sound. W. Who could that be? No one in the parish. Oh, plenty of people have names beginning with W, Wimsey said amiably. Walters, Wilkinson, Woodford, or indeed someone with no right to sign their presence here at all. He placed the book back on the desk with deliberate precision. I think, Mrs. Hallow, that I have taken up enough of your time. Pray do not concern yourself with the disturbances we have uncovered. These small misplacements, these faint irregularities, they rarely lie. That is the most comforting thing about a well-run household. Its very order betrays the hand that attempts to alter it. She looked troubled, but curtsied and withdrew. When she had gone, Wimsey stood in the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, gaze drifting again to the churchyard outside. "My lord?" Bunter murmured. Wimsey inhaled deeply, as though taking in the scent of something elusive. An idea, not a perfume. "Bunter, my good fellow," he said at last, "the pattern is growing clearer. But there remains one question of paramount importance." "And that is, my lord?" Wimsey's voice dropped, reflective and grave. Why would a woman who feared the churchyard hums open her window wider on the night she died? The question hung in the quiet chamber like incense, thin, persistent, impossible to ignore. The vicar shifted uneasily, glancing from Wimsey to the shutter with helpless incomprehension, while Bunter's expression remained serenely attentive, as though he had expected precisely this line of thought all along. Wimsey, however, did not elaborate. He drifted from the window to the bedside table, then to the wardrobe once more, as if reacquainting himself with the physical grammar of the room. His fingers hovered above the quilt, tracing the faint, imperceptible line where the bedspread had been smoothed. At last he gave a faint sigh and turned toward the door. "Gentlemen," he announced lightly, "I believe our next productive avenue lies not within these walls, but below them, among the good, honest stones of the churchyard. There are impressions, you know, that the earth records rather better than people. Earth does not forget, though it sometimes misplaces." The vicar looked at him with a sort of pained resignation. "Lord Peter, if you intend to prowl around the graves again, I must insist that you do so with caution. The Holst plot has not been disturbed since the funeral." Wimsey raised a brow. "Since the official funeral, you mean. Very proper, but nature, Canon Atherton, is notoriously informal with its schedules. Shall we?" They descended the stairs. As they passed the lower corridor, Wimsey paused abruptly beside a narrow servants' passage, glancing down its dim length with a peculiar attentiveness. "Ah," he murmured, "another piece of our domestic theatre." Bunter followed his gaze. "The passage appears unused, my lord." "Unused things," Wimsey said pleasantly, "have an unfortunate tendency to be used at precisely the wrong moment, like umbrellas or maiden aunts." He tapped his cane thoughtfully, then resumed walking as though nothing of significance had occurred. But the vicar, who had learned by now to fear such offhand observations, trotted after them in a state of mild alarm. Outside, the air had sharpened, scouring the mist away and leaving the churchyard crisp under a wan, mid-afternoon light. Wimsey entered through the small wooden gate, not the lich gate, and paced between the rows of stones with a purposeful aimlessness. "Bunter," he called softly, "let us test a little notion of mine." He stopped beside the Holst plot, a simple stone, not ostentatious, with the husband's name carved cleanly, and room, one supposed, for the widows beneath. Wimsey crouched and examined the ground around the grave with professional detachment. The soil was firm, slightly frosted at the edges, and unbroken. "Not here," he murmured. "Not here at all, which tells us precisely what we need to know." The vicar blinked. "It tells us something." "Quite a few things." Primarily that whoever prowled beneath the window on the night in question had no interest in Mr. Holst's resting place. They stood here. He stepped several feet to the right, where the light from the widow's window would not fall directly upon them. Bunter eyed the ground stoically. "Disturbance, my lord." "Only the faintest. But look, Bunter. Observe the compression of the moss. A small patch, worn unevenly, no more than a foot's width. And there," he pointed, "a second depression further back. Ah, yes. Someone stood here. Not long, but long enough." The vicar bent, squinting. "I see nothing." "That is because you are searching for footprints. What we want is intention." He stepped backwards until the angle aligned perfectly between the two depressions and the window above. "There. From this position, the shutter's inner gap is visible, and from that gap, one might glimpse the room. More importantly, one might gauge whether someone within is watching." The vicar swallowed. "Lord Peter, why would anyone do that?" "That," Wimsey replied cheerfully, "is the sort of uncharitable curiosity that tends to end in murder." He knelt again, brushing away a dried leaf. Something dark caught the light, thin, metallic. Wimsey pinched it between two fingers and held it up. "A hairpin," he announced, "of a style our widow did not wear, and bent recently." Bunter adjusted his spectacles. "A lady's hairpin, my lord?" "More likely a young lady's, or a decidedly nervous one." He slipped it into his pocket beside the scrap of paper found earlier. "One does not shed hairpins in churchyards without very good reason. Terror is a likely candidate. Guilt even more so." The wind rustled the yew branches overhead with a faint whisper, and the vicar shivered. Wimsey rose. "Let us consider the implications. Our late widow hears sounds outside her window, sounds she associates with the churchyard. On the night of her death, her window is open wider than she herself ever dared open it. The shutter, stiff though it is, has been moved. The curtains, not fully closed, betray movement. And outside," he gestured to the disturbed moss, "someone watches her room." The vicar's voice shook. "But why, Lord Peter? Why would anyone wish to frighten her?" "Oh, Canon Atherton," Wimsey replied gently, "you assume fear was the intended effect." He brushed his hands together. "But terror is merely a convenient byproduct, if what one truly desires is access. Access to a room, access to a woman, access to something she possesses." He began walking toward the low stone wall at the far edge of the churchyard. "It is high time we tested our chronology again," he announced. "For timelines, like curtains, occasionally snag and reveal more than intended." "What do you hope to find?" the vicar asked, hurrying after him. "A vantage point," Wimsey said lightly. "The place from which our intruder climbed into, or out of, the widow's world." He stopped suddenly at the boundary wall and looked down. The frost on the topmost stones was faintly disturbed. Wimsey's smile sharpened. "Well, gentlemen," he murmured, "the dead may keep their peace, but the living leave trails even when they believe themselves ghosts. And our ghost, I fancy, did rather more than hum lullabies under a widow's window." He tapped the wall with his cane, then added softly, "And now we must discover what they wished to conceal, and what the widow knew that warranted such a perilous visit." The inspector's words seemed to settle over the room like a layer of frost, chilling every remaining whisper. Colonel Hargreaves's jaw tightened. His hands, usually steady, trembled as he reached for the arm of his chair. Miss Marple watched him without blinking, her expression soft but unyielding, as though she were silently urging him toward honesty. Lady Winthrop, meanwhile, clutched her shawl and cast nervous glances at the door, as if afraid that someone, perhaps the true killer, might slip in unnoticed. But before anyone else could speak, a sharp rap sounded at the entrance. The butler stepped in, bowed apologetically, and handed the inspector a folded note. Inspector Graves scanned it once, and a faint spark of interest lit his eyes. "It appears," he said slowly, that one of our quiet assumptions was incorrect. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her knitting needles pausing mid-air. "Oh dear," she murmured, not in surprise but in confirmation, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. The inspector read aloud, "The laboratory reports indicate the fingerprints on the lantern do not match Mr. Fletcher's." A ripple of shock moved through the group. "They belong," Graves continued, glancing up, "to someone who handled the lantern recently, very recently, within the last 24 hours. Colonel Hargreaves stiffened. Lady Winthrop gasped. Only Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her eyes moving from one face to another, quietly taking inventory of guilt, fear, or calculation. The inspector folded the note. "Someone here," he said in a low, deliberate tone, "tampered with the lantern after the body was discovered." A nerve twitched along Lady Winthrop's jaw. "But why?" she whispered. "What good would that do?" Miss Marple answered gently. "To shift suspicion, my dear, or to conceal something the lantern may have illuminated." The colonel swallowed hard. "You cannot be suggesting." "I suggest nothing," Miss Marple said. "I only observe." Her eyes rested on him a moment longer than comfort allowed. The colonel immediately looked away. Before Graves could press the matter, a shout echoed from the hallway. Boots pounded against the wooden floor, and Constable Reed burst into the room, breathless. "Inspector, we've found something behind the tool shed. Something you'll want to see at once." Graves rose instantly. Miss Marple set her knitting aside with calm precision. Lady Winthrop clung to the back of her chair, trembling. Colonel Hargreaves hesitated, wiping his palms against his trousers before following the others out into the cold night air. The garden was darker now. Clouds had swallowed the moon, leaving only the faint flicker of lantern light to guide them. The constable led them around the house, past the hedges that shivered in the breeze, until they reached the old tool shed. Behind it, half buried under fallen leaves and damp soil, lay a bundle wrapped in coarse cloth. Constable Reed crouched and pulled the top layer back. Inside was a heavy iron crowbar, its end stained with a dark, unmistakable residue. Inspector Graves exhaled sharply. This could be our murder weapon." Miss Marple didn't look at the crowbar. She watched the colonel instead. His lips had gone pale. His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, and then, as if realizing she was studying him, he straightened abruptly and forced a steadier expression. But Miss Marple had already seen it, and so, she suspected, had the inspector. What neither of them voiced, but both understood, was that the discovery of the crowbar did not simplify the case. It complicated it. For the weapon, hidden so clumsily and found so conveniently, seemed almost too perfect, placed rather than lost. Hidden not to remain undiscovered, but to be discovered at the precise moment when suspicion needed somewhere new to land. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Inspector," she said softly, "I believe we may be getting close. But do take care. The truth, when cornered, can be quite dangerous." Graves nodded, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he stared at the crowbar and then at the darkened windows of the house behind them. "Then we tread carefully," he said, "and we start with the person who had the most to lose." Once the lights went out. Wimsey's return to the manor later that afternoon carried an air of casual triumph, though he himself betrayed nothing beyond the arch, teasing smile that had become so familiar in these investigations. Bunter followed with the quiet, watchful patience of a man who had long ago learned that the pleasure of observation often outweighed the irritation of hurried action. The widow's room had been left untouched, its small revelations already catalogued and filed in Wimsey's mind with meticulous care. He moved across the drawing room, tapping a finger lightly against the piano's polished lid. It was a gesture as much symbolic as practical. He was acknowledging the domestic tableau as it presented itself, orderly, serene, yet hiding the tensions of unseen hands and motives. "I think," Whimsy began, eyes flicking to Bunter, "that we may now focus on the more theatrical elements of our puzzle." He allowed a pause, letting the phrase hang in the air with a faintly ironic weight. "For our intruder, clever as he or she may have been, has overlooked a triviality. Something so small that it appears insignificant until one considers the chronology and the constraints of movement." Bunter, patient as ever, tilted his head slightly. "Are we speaking, my lord, of footprints, perhaps? Or the arrangements of furniture?" Whimsy smiled faintly, but his gaze sharpened. "Neither, Bunter. The constraint I refer to is more temporal. It involves the very timing of events, the periods when eyes were elsewhere, doors were closed, and yet movements occurred within precise, confined intervals. We must consider who could have accessed the room, and for what purpose, while still leaving themselves plausible deniability." He drifted toward the window, the same one that overlooked the churchyard, and gazed at the slope of the ground below. His cane tapped lightly against the sill, marking out an invisible rhythm. There lies our stage, and upon it the audience of witnesses remains completely oblivious. The shadows, Bunter, do not lie. They merely obscure the truth until one chooses to peer past them. The butler nodded, noting Whimsy's careful attention to angles and light. "Your lordship, might I fetch the vicar? He has been most anxious to provide any information we require." Whimsy waved a hand dismissively. "Patience, Bunter. Canon Atherton's contributions have been invaluable, but the hour for him is yet to arrive. First, we must examine a point so trivial that it appears meaningless, yet it is the hinge upon which the whole affair turns." He crouched briefly, inspecting the edge of the window ledge. A small smudge of dust, partially wiped, caught his eye. He tapped it lightly with a fingertip and lifted it to the light. "Ah," he murmured, almost to himself, a finger that lingered too long, a movement that betrayed hesitation, and yet the owner of this hand, if one can call it that, was no stranger to stealth. Bunter's eyebrows rose. "So we are considering a second visitor, my lord?" "Precisely. Not a visitor in the conventional sense, but an opportunist, aware of the widow's habits, her fears, and her peculiar obsession with the churchyard. Someone who timed their entry with knowledge of her routines, and who understood that the outward appearances of order could be manipulated for momentary advantage." Whimsy straightened and turned toward the room, surveying it with a faint air of contemplation. "Observe, Bunter. The salver displaced, the shutter nudged, the curtains drawn unevenly. A trifling series of disturbances, you might say. Yet when aligned with the timing of the widow's death, these trifles reveal the intruder's path, both literal and figurative." He picked up the scrap of paper and the bent hairpin he had recovered earlier, examining them in tandem. "See here, Bunter. The paper suggests prior clandestine communication, something the widow alone could have known. And this," he held the hairpin delicately between thumb and forefinger, "was evidently lost during the approach or the retreat of our unknown, a signature of haste or perhaps anxiety." Bunter adjusted his spectacles. "But, my lord, the police have yet to locate any person capable of such discreet movements." Whimsy's lips curved into a faint, satisfied smile. "Bunter, the delight of a mystery lies precisely in what has not yet been discovered. The police hunt in obvious places. We, my dear fellow, must hunt in the spaces between, where observation falters and subtlety reigns." He turned back to the window, gazing at the churchyard with an almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. "And now, Bunter, we begin the delicate task of reconstructing the intruder's approach and, more importantly, the motive that guided it. Every detail we have uncovered, the shutter, the salver, the hairpin, the scrap of paper, constitutes a series of logical steps. And it is only by following these steps with unrelenting precision that we shall arrive at the person who dared intrude upon the widow's room, and the reason for their audacity." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Outside, the churchyard remained quiet, deceptively still, as though the very air conspired to keep its secrets. Yet Whimsy's keen gaze was undeterred. He tapped the cane lightly against the floor, an almost imperceptible rhythm that marked the march of deduction. "Bunter," he said at last, "fetch a pencil and paper. It is time we map the movements of our mysterious visitor, minute by minute, step by step. For the solution, like a fine piece of music, lies in the arrangement, not the notes themselves." And with that, the stage was set. The next phase of investigation poised to expose not only the intruder, but the intricate psychology that had led to the widow's untimely death. Whimsy's pencil scratched quietly against the paper, plotting angles and distances with the meticulous care of a man accustomed to the patience required by both geometry and human folly. Bunter arranged the scraps of evidence across the table, the bent hairpin, the tiny thread, the folded paper, and Whimsy's eyes darted between them as if conversing silently with the objects themselves. "Note carefully, Bunter," Whimsy said, tapping the hairpin, "the relative positions. The shutter, stiff and partially opened, implies leverage. The curtain, a mere distraction, yes, but a deliberate one. And the salver, displaced ever so slightly, tells us of movement within the room simultaneous with these exterior actions." Bunter followed, nodding. "So we are reconstructing both the interior and exterior timelines concurrently." "Precisely. And in doing so, we begin to see a pattern emerge, not of random intrusion, but of deliberate orchestration. The intruder was not a mere opportunist. This was someone intimately familiar with her habits, her fears, and, more crucially, the small gaps left by daily routine." Whimsy drew a series of lines across the paper, marking the window, the tree outside, the edge of the churchyard, and the worn patch of moss beneath the widow's window. "Here," he said, pointing to the moss, "our visitor stood, not once but twice, allowing for observation of the room and the timing necessary to exploit a particular interval in which the widow was isolated." Bunter frowned. "But, my lord, there are still two unknowns: the visitor's identity and the purpose behind their visit. We know only that it required stealth, precision, and courage. Or desperation." Whimsy's eyes glimmered with mild amusement. "Desperation, Bunter, is a far more potent motivator than courage. It explains errors made, haste in retreat, and the very carelessness that left our bent hairpin and thread behind." He leaned back, glancing toward the window where the fading light reflected off the glass with an almost mocking brilliance. "Consider, too, the scrap of paper. A mere initial, yet in context it signifies premeditation. Someone who communicated with the widow, yet wished for secrecy. Someone whose boldness, or perhaps impudence, was matched by their calculation." Bunter adjusted his spectacles, following the lines Whimsy had drawn, the web of evidence beginning to take shape. "Lord Peter, if we align these details with the timeline of her death, we may narrow the possibilities to a very small window of opportunity, both in time and in circumstance." "Exactly," Whimsy said, tapping the table lightly. "Now we must consider who, within the household or among her acquaintances, had both motive and the knowledge required to navigate these subtle constraints." He rose, pacing the length of the room, hands clasped behind his back, each step measured. "Motive is seldom obvious, Bunter. Money, jealousy, fear of exposure, all these play their parts, but rarely in isolation. We must combine motive with opportunity and knowledge. Only then does the fog begin to clear." He paused before the window once more, looking at the churchyard. The fading light cast elongated shadows across the ground, illuminating the worn patch of moss as though it were a stage awaiting its actors. "And now," Whimsy murmured, "we have the advantage of perspective. Not merely of the room, nor of the exterior, but of the interplay between the two. The intruder underestimated the widow's observation and overestimated their own subtlety. That will be their undoing. Bunter leaned closer. Shall we interview the servants again, my lord, or perhaps those who had occasion to visit her in the days preceding her death? Wimsey shook his head, a faint, enigmatic smile playing upon his lips. No, Bunter. First, we must test our reconstruction against reality itself. We need a demonstration, an enactment of movements, timings, and opportunities. Only then will the culprit, if still watching or listening, reveal themselves by overconfidence or misjudgment. He paused at the door, glancing back at the scattered evidence, the meticulous drawings, and the careful chronology laid out before them. Prepare yourself, Bunter. The next step is theatrical, but in this theater, the props are truth and the stage. Well, it is precisely this room and the ground beneath that widow's window. And once we have observed the performance, we shall understand not only the visitor's path, but their motive, and perhaps, in a single stroke of logic, expose the hand that committed this deplorable act. With that, Wimsey began gathering the papers and evidence, his movements brisk, precise, and quietly confident. Outside, the shadows lengthened, but inside, the quiet determination of a master detective was absolute. The trap was being set, subtly and unnoticeably, and only one outcome remained likely: the unraveling of the carefully concealed truth. Wimsey moved with quiet determination toward the window, taking the hairpin and thread from his pocket and setting them gently on the sill as if they were instruments in a delicate experiment. Bunter followed, holding the folded scrap of paper, while the room seemed to lean forward with expectation, as though the very furniture were aware that the moment of revelation was approaching. "Bunter," Wimsey murmured, eyes tracing the outline of the widow's window. "We have tested the chronology, traced the approach, and noted the intruder's errors. Now we must reconstruct the final moments, the choices that led to her death. Observe carefully. The window, the shutter, the curtains, the salver, all elements in a small but decisive theater." He crouched, pointing to the worn moss beneath the widow's window. "Here," the intruder paused. "And here," he indicated the second depression. They adjusted their stance, hesitated, considered. That hesitation was crucial. It betrayed uncertainty, or perhaps indecision regarding the next action. Bunter nodded silently, understanding that the observation was more than mere guesswork. It was reasoning distilled to its purest form. Wimsey then retrieved the leather-bound visitor's book. And here, we see the motive sketched faintly in ink. The entry 3 days prior, the initial W. Who is it that corresponds to this letter? Who had reason to approach her, to communicate, and yet maintain secrecy? He let the question linger, then turned to the window and pressed his hand against the ledge. Notice the subtle scratch marks. They are fresh. The hairpin, bent in haste, fell while being used, either to manipulate the shutter or to secure the curtain temporarily. The intruder intended to observe or to act, but their focus on the widow's habits betrayed a lack of understanding of the environment. And that, Bunter, is how logic begins to constrict the possibilities. He moved back, standing fully, and let his gaze sweep across the room. Everything aligns now. The misaligned shutter, the half-drawn curtains, the displaced salver, the bent hairpin, the thread caught in velvet. These are not random. Each corresponds to a movement, an adjustment, a small action intended to avoid detection, yet revealing the hand behind them. And all of it converges upon the widow's vulnerability, timed perfectly with her routine, her attention elsewhere. Bunter's voice was quiet. "But the question remains, my lord. Who could have done it? And why? Who knew her routines well enough to manipulate them so precisely?" Wimsey's eyes sparkled with a mixture of mischief and gravity. "Ah, Bunter, therein lies the elegance of our inquiry. The answer is not in a single moment nor a single act. It is in the combination of observation, opportunity, and psychology. The intruder was someone familiar with the widow, someone who had access both to her room and to the subtle details of her life, and, most importantly, someone who understood her fears intimately enough to exploit them. He paused, tapping the hairpin gently against the table. "And there," he said softly, "we have the final clue. The strand of thread, the bent pin, the subtle disturbance of velvet and wood. They point not merely to presence, but to haste, desperation. Someone attempting to achieve their goal before the widow or any witness could intervene." Whimsy's eyes met Bunter's. "And now comes the moment, Bunter, when theory becomes proof. The intruder, believing themselves clever, has overlooked one detail, the human element. Fear, routine, observation, all these leave marks that logic cannot be fooled by. And it is precisely these marks that will lead us to the person who committed this act." He gathered the evidence with deliberate care, tucking the hairpin, thread, and paper back into his pocket. The stage is set, the players are in position, and the audience, though unwitting, is ready. All that remains is to provoke the intruder into revealing themselves either through overconfidence, carelessness, or the simple miscalculation of time. And when they do, he allowed the pause to linger, serene and assured. "We shall know, Bunter. We shall know everything." Outside, the twilight deepened, shadows lengthening across the churchyard, but inside the widow's room, the air was electric with anticipation. Every object, every detail, every subtle trace left behind now spoke a coherent language. And in that silence, Lord Peter Wimsey prepared to draw the final line, from observation to deduction, from suspicion to inevitable confrontation. Night had settled fully over the manor when Wimsey and Bunter finally prepared to enact the plan that had been silently taking shape in the past hours. The household had been lulled into a deceptive calm, the servants unaware of the careful orchestration unfolding under the flickering lamplight of the widow's chamber. Even the vicar, summoned under the pretext of final observations, had been persuaded to linger in the library with polite refreshments, his curiosity restrained by civility and trust in Lord Peter's discretion. Wimsey moved with deliberate calm, placing the hairpin and scrap of paper in a small envelope. "Bunter," he murmured, "we need not merely reconstruct events. We must create the conditions under which the intruder, confident, perhaps brazen, reveals their own knowledge, their own intent." The butler inclined his head. "Your lordship, shall we simulate the widow's presence, or are we relying on the intruder's audacity?" "Both," Wimsey said with a faint smile, a hint of the former and the certainty of the latter. "Fear and opportunity, when mingled, are rarely controlled by the person who attempts it." He adjusted the window shutter with precise care, leaving it open just enough to suggest a vulnerable room, yet not enough to permit true entry. The curtains, weighted subtly with small discreet hooks, fell into slight asymmetry as they had the night of the tragedy. Every detail was faithful to memory, down to the faint, almost imperceptible bend in the salver's edge. "Now," Wimsey whispered, drawing back, "we wait and observe." They stationed themselves in shadow, just beyond the edge of the churchyard, where the faint illumination from the widow's window allowed a careful eye to detect even the subtlest movements. The frost of the evening gleamed under the muted moonlight, catching the smallest trace of disturbed soil, as though nature itself were eager to cooperate in the revelation of truth. Time passed with measured, almost excruciating slowness. And then a shadow detached itself from the darker recesses near the yew trees. A figure approached the widow's window, cautious, deliberate, yet unmistakably human in their hesitation. Wimsey's lips curled in a faint arch smile. "Observe carefully, Bunter," he whispered. "Every step, every pause, every hand lifted, these are the signatures of intent. Notice the way they hesitate at the shutter. They are unsure, despite familiarity. That doubt betrays something." The figure adjusted the window slightly, attempting to reach the sill when a gloved hand brushed against the curtain. The thread snagged lightly, a detail Whimsy had anticipated. The intruder froze, hands hovering, and then, almost imperceptibly, retrieved a small object from their pocket. "The hairpin," Whimsy murmured. "See? Recognition, panic, and an attempt at concealment all at once. Our intruder knows the room intimately, yet not enough to move unobserved." Bunter stiffened. "Shall we confront them now, my lord?" "Not yet," Whimsy replied, voice calm and measured. "Let us allow their own actions to speak. Timing is crucial. The more they believe themselves clever, the more they will expose. Watch the left hand, Bunter, the one nearest the shutter. Note how it trembles slightly. The visitor is desperate, but not reckless. Observe also the glance upward, the calculation, the evaluation of risk. We have them on their own stage, Bunter. They do not yet know we are the audience." The figure fumbled briefly, retrieving the scrap of paper from an inner pocket. They peered at it, aligning its contents with the widow's room. Then, seemingly satisfied, they pressed the paper into the slit between shutter and frame, attempting to conceal it while leaning inside. Whimsy's sharp inhale was barely audible. "Ah, there. Now the pattern is complete. The note, the thread, the hairpin, they align precisely with the movements we reconstructed. The intruder seeks not merely to observe, but to place evidence, mislead, and perhaps remove something of value, and in doing so..." A faint creak sounded above them, the shutter giving way just slightly under the pressure of the intruder's hand. Whimsy's eyes glimmered with satisfaction. And they have betrayed the timing, the second pause, the hesitation. Their own eagerness to avoid detection is the very thing that exposes them. And now, Bunter, we move." He stepped forward from the shadow, voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "I believe, my dear friend, you have been observed long enough." The figure froze, spinning slowly toward the sound, eyes wide beneath the hood. And in that instant, every subtle detail, the thread, the hairpin, the precise alignment of the window converged into a single, undeniable truth. "Yes," Whimsy said quietly, almost to himself, "it is as I suspected." The intruder's shoulders slumped, a brief flicker of recognition passing across their features, and in that moment, the careful web of deception they had spun began to unravel before the patient, exacting gaze of Lord Peter Whimsy. The morning after the confrontation dawned pale and clear, the churchyard bathed in soft, forgiving light. The manor, once tense with secrecy and suspicion, had returned to its outwardly placid routine, though those who lingered in corners still cast wary glances at one another. Whimsy, cigar in hand, stood on the terrace overlooking the widow's window, the faint echo of last night's revelation lingering in the air. Bunter was beside him, notebook in hand, recording the minutiae of the case. Not for the police, not for posterity, but for the satisfaction of order restored. "Well, Bunter," Whimsy said, eyes glinting with arch amusement, "it appears that the human mind, even when cloaked in careful calculation, cannot entirely resist leaving traces of its intentions. A hairpin, a thread, a moment of hesitation. Such trifles as these have guided us to our culprit with remarkable fidelity." Bunter nodded. "And yet, my lord, the widow, her secrets, her fears, she was not entirely blameless in allowing such access, was she?" Whimsy inhaled, letting the smoke curl lazily upward. "No one is blameless, Bunter. Not in the theater of life. The widow had her routines, her habits, her trust, and someone exploited them. That, alas, is enough to create tragedy. But we, having restored clarity, may now observe without confusion." A carriage rumbled along the drive below, announcing the arrival of the authorities to take the intruder into proper custody. Whimsy flicked the ash from his cigar and smiled faintly. "And there, Bunter, is the delightful resolution of all such matters. Civility maintained, justice served, and yet the human element, messy, fallible and altogether fascinating, remains intact. He turned to Bunter with a dry, ironic lift of his brow. And so we depart, leaving the manor, the widow's room, and the churchyard to their usual quietude. Our work, as ever, concludes with observation, deduction, and, in the most satisfying cases, the gentle triumph of logic over artifice. Bunter inclined his head respectfully. "Shall we return to London, my lord?" "Indeed," Whimsy replied. "There are other mysteries, Bunter, and always more human folly to examine. But for now, let the widow's room face the churchyard in peace. Nature and truth have had their say." As they walked down the terrace steps and toward the waiting carriage, Whimsy cast one final glance at the window where the faint trace of shadow remained, a reminder that even in resolution, the subtleties of human character endure. And with a soft chuckle and an almost imperceptible flourish of his cane, Lord Peter Whimsy and Bunter departed, leaving the quiet English morning to resume its gentle, deceptive calm. The case was closed. The widow's secrets had been honored, the culprit exposed, and justice, delivered with the subtle grace and quiet logic that only Lord Peter Whimsy could achieve, had prevailed. The shadows of the past lingered faintly, as they always do, but clarity and reason had taken their rightful place, firm, enduring, and quietly triumphant. And so, with a final arch smile and a courteous tip of the hat to human folly itself, Lord Peter Whimsy vanished from sight, leaving behind only the faint trace of intellect, irony, and the satisfaction of a mystery solved.